over to you, and for everybody else, enjoy the conversation. Thanks.
Great. Thanks a lot, Sudha, for that introduction. And I'm pleased to welcome Matt Duss to this conversation. Matt is currently a senior foreign policy advisor to Senator Bernie Sanders. He worked with him on his presidential campaign, and I think is now, although it looks like he's working from home, is back in the Senate supporting Senator Sanders. I've known him I was trying to figure out today when the first time was that we met. I think it was probably at least a decade ago, maybe a bit longer, when we used to debate Iran policy and Middle East issues in a variety of settings. I've gotten to know him a bit over the years, and Matt, beyond his work for Senator Sanders, has been a longtime activist related to Middle East politics, a writer, blogger at the Center for American Progress. And right now, he's, I think, right in the middle of the debate that's unfolding in the Democratic Party about the future of democratic foreign policy, which I think we're going to want to get into. So we've titled this session today, Democracy in the Digital Age, and I thought we'd start off a little bit just talking about the role that the digital space is playing in American politics right now, and then get into some broader foreign policy issues. And as Sudha said, partway through, open it up for all of you to submit questions and ask your questions of Matt. So maybe I'll just start off on the digital aspect. I worked for Senator Rubio in 2016 as his foreign policy advisor. I think a lot of us on the right were amazed about the role that social media and digital engagement played in that election. I think the trend has only been increasing in American politics on both the left and right, and the importance of those platforms for our political conversations. The pandemic has now probably increased digital engagement even more about politics and made it more difficult for in-person engagement between politicians and prospective voters. And so, Matt, I just wanted to ask you, what are your reflections, having lived through the primary on the Democratic side in 2020, about the role that digital platforms are playing for voters on the left and for politicians who are out there trying to push a message and trying to get votes?
Sure. No, I mean, it's a really important issue and a great question. And first, let me just say thank you to the German Marshall Fund for having me here. It's a pleasure. And Jamie, I'm trying to think myself. Yeah, I think it is over 10 years. I think it was when you first started as director of the Foreign Policy Initiative, and we had a number of very lively and very interesting, for me, debates, which people can probably still access on the Blogging Heads a website. And also, just let me quickly clarify, just here speaking, these are my own views, so not speaking for the senator, though I continue to be, quite privileged to work with him. Yeah, I think, going back, I think 2008, the 2008 election, with, the Obama-McCain election, I think that was one of the first times we really saw campaigns, both of the campaigns, but I think particularly the Obama campaign, using these, using technology to reach out, to organize, to get, donations, especially small dollar donations. And I think we've seen that continue. As with all kind of, tech tools, I mean, there are upsides and there are downsides. I think, one of the clear upsides is the ability of candidates, of leaders and activists and others to communicate directly to audiences in real time, very quickly, not having to kind of, schedule a press avail or a press conference and then go in front of a bank of microphones and make the statement and then, go on. They can just immediately kind of work on a statement and put it out there either on Twitter or through Facebook or both. And respond much more quickly to events as they occur, and that obviously that moves the debate quicker. It changes the nature of or certainly the speed of the discussion. But I think the downside here is just the sheer volume of information that's out there. While it is good for, I think, politicians to be able to communicate with, and not just a one-way communication, but a two-way communication. I think the challenge is sometimes others can use these tools as well, and others who have, let's just say, less of an interest in accurate or correct or, you know, remotely reality-based information. And I know you in your work, you know, especially with regard to foreign interference in the election, you know, are well aware of this. So I think, you know, I think some of the principles and the challenges that we're dealing with are not necessarily new to, you know, the technology. I mean, even in the proliferation of cable news, in, you know, the use of, you know, talk radio, there was always the question, okay, who, you know, how does information gain credibility? How do you know what to believe? What tools can you help people get to determine what is true and what is false? You know, because this, at the end of the day, is information they are basing their vote on, and that has an enormous impact on our democracy.
Did you find during your work on the campaign that the fact that a lot of this engagement with voters was moving online, and as you noted, had been moving online in previous cycles, did it fundamentally change the way that you and your candidate tried to talk about policy? Did you find that, you know, you had to move to shorter sound bites, to brief messages that were more workable online, or did you not feel that it was fundamentally changing the way that you were engaging in the policy debate?
You know, it's interesting because I think, you know, one thing about, if you look at Senator Sanders, going back to the very beginning of his, you know, kind of political career when he became mayor of Burlington, I mean, there were some great videos that came out during the primary that showed like these, you know, grainy you know, videos that he had made as mayor, going out into the community, talking to residents, talking to kids about various issues. He's always seen his role as partly educational, which is to help voters, help citizens understand or have more information about all of our shared challenges. And I think that is, and he, you know, that very much carries forward into the way he deals with things now. I mean, Facebook, Twitter, these are just other tools to kind of carry forward that very important part of his approach. So I think, you know, in some cases, I mean, to answer your question, I don't think there's a hard and fast rule. I think, you know, it depends on the situation. Sometimes a shorter, snappier response is appropriate. And there are other times where longer, more complex or nuanced statements are required. And I think that comes down to each individual leader or politician or whomever deciding how, you know, how best to carry forward their message.
Do you have any concerns from what you've seen, the way that voters are engaging online, that and especially through social media, that it's elevating outrage politics, that obviously content that's more likely to go viral is what will get shared and what the algorithms will amplify? Did you see any of that during the primary process that made you stop and ask yourself, is this really healthy for American democracy?
No, I ask myself that pretty much every day. I mean, I think, yes, what you said, the algorithm, but again, this is not something that just arises out of nature, right? The algorithm is programmed, you know, by Mark Zuckerberg or his crew at Facebook. They are making choices to promote certain content and downplay other content for the reason of making more money. And I think that's, again, as I said earlier, this is a challenge that has been part of media, how we regulate media or don't regulate media, that far precedes the rise of, you know, the social media, all these other things. Goes back to the very earliest days. You know, the days of broadsheets when it was just Adams and Jefferson attacking each other. You could see some of these challenges as well. It's like, who decides what's acceptable and what's true, what's false, and what's permissible? And this is a very, you know, this is a fundamental question in our democracy. I mean, our freedom of speech and constraining the government from simply weighing in and saying, nope, that's wrong, can't say that. We are rightly very cautious about that. But at the same time, I think we see the accrual of so much power in the hands of a small group of people, or with regard to Facebook, one person who is able to say yes or no to certain information that has very, very, you know, serious real world impact. We can run down the list, whether it's Myanmar, whether it's, you know, some of the challenges dealing in Europe with the rise of populist authoritarianism. We certainly see that here in the United States. So I think these tools, at some point, you know, we really need to take a hard look at, you know, I think we can agree we have a compelling public interest in kind of coming, determining how these things function. But it's, this is all very new to all of us, but I think coming to an agreement on that core proposition is really important.
Where do you see that debate going on, especially on the left, in the coming years? I mean, because there have been proposals by a number of Democrats, including Elizabeth Warren and others, to promote more regulation, to break up big tech. And the interesting thing is, on the right, you hear some similar critiques, including from President Trump himself, but the reality is I don't think the administration has ended up doing much vis-a-vis the tech companies, and the president obviously benefits a lot from the promotion of his content on certain social media platforms. So walk us through kind of how you see that debate possibly evolving on the left in the next couple of years.
Right. Well, I think it's important to the debate on the left, and here I would point to the work of people like Matt Stoller, who I think has paid a lot of attention and done a lot of good work with regard to the problem of antitrust and monopoly, particularly the fact that we don't tend to enforce those kinds of things anymore. I think some of the, from a progressive perspective, I think some of the best progressive advances were done precisely in breaking up large concentrations of business and corporate power. And I think those are some of the principles we're dealing with here. Now, we should obviously expect some pushback. Corporations don't like to be, forced to accept regulations that would cause them to make less money. But I think the challenge is to mount that argument about the compelling public interest that we have, that our democracy is going to benefit from breaking some of these companies up, for example, from separating out the content side from the advertising side. And again, I don't pretend that these problems are going to be easy. It's going to be a large political challenge to make and win the argument. But I think it's coming to, as I was saying before, coming to an agreement that we can see some of the negative impacts in our own democracy, in our own politics, and into the politics of our close allies and partners in Europe and beyond.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting issue because, like I said, there are similar critiques on both the left and the right. I don't think there's bipartisan agreement right now on the solutions, but it strikes me as an area where you could see some sort of unlikely coalition emerge in the coming years behind some sort of legislation to move in a direction of more regulation. And honestly, I'm telling my European friends here all the time that in some respects, it might mean doing some of the things that Europe has already started to do vis-a-vis the companies and learning some of the lessons from the European experience. I want to talk a little bit about disinformation and interference, but you mentioned some of the work that we've done here at GMF on that. And particularly through the prism of your work on the Sanders campaign, because it's an interesting angle. Because in both 2016 and in 2020, I think the US intelligence assessments that have been made public have talked about the Russians trying to basically exploit Sanders voters and to try to kind of lure them one way or the other. Clearly, some of that demographic has been targeted by foreign actors. And just talk me through how the campaign grappled with that, how the campaign decided to talk about that publicly, because that's been a major challenge, obviously, on the other side when it comes to the Trump administration about talking honestly about this threat.
Right. No, well, I think, I think how we dealt with it publicly was exactly how Senator Sanders spoke about it when he was asked about it, which was absolutely unequivocally rejecting foreign interference, Russian interference, or anyone's interference in our democracy. I think he's been very consistent from the very beginning on these issues, rejecting interference, saying we need to understand what happened. It would be great if the president of the United States actually agreed with his own intelligence community about what actually did happen, as unfortunately President Trump does not. But also saying we are going to continue, this should not, we need to be wary about this. We need to be aware of it. We need to reject it, but we also need to carry forward with our political debate. It would be a mistake to allow that, the reality of interference, which is ongoing, to kind of force us to abridge some of, our, this aggressive debate we want to have about what we need to do to reform, change, and improve our democracy. Because I think this gets at, what I think is one of the most important things to understand here is that, Putin or whomever are exploiting fissures. They did not create these fissures. I think, as we have seen, pretty starkly in the last few months, particularly in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. I mean, these are challenges, the legacy of white supremacy, of racism, of slavery, and the economic and political and racial inequality that still persists in our society. I mean, these are very American problems, and others exploit them to create chaos, as it may be in the case of Russia. That's clearly what Putin wants, just to weaken, to exploit these fissures, to weaken our democracy and set us against each other. So I think, I think the way we should approach this is to say, let's have these debates in a responsible and truthful way. That doesn't mean we need to kind of shy away from these disagreements, because that's central to democracy, is having these debates and trying to adjudicate them fairly.
So where did Senator Sanders end up on Russia policy in the debates with his rivals? And what's your assessment about where the Democratic Party debate about Russia is going? I've obviously been struck by it, watching Democrats evolve on Russia over the last decade. And I'm very curious personally, if there is a Biden administration, whether you're really going to see a kind of hawkish, tough approach towards Russia, or whether there are going to be voices, which I think we've already started to see bubble up in some public letters that have been issued from arms control hands and others, who are going to say, yes, we've got challenges from Russia, but we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We need engagement. We need to try a different approach, at least on a select number of global issues where we need U.S.-Russian cooperation.
Yeah.
And kind of where do you and Senator Sanders fall in that debate, and how do you think that debate's going to get resolved on the left?
Yeah, I would say, Senator Sanders falls in the latter part of that, which is to say, let's understand the challenge that Russia poses. Let's understand both in terms of their, Putin's, invasion of Ukraine, the annexation of Crimea, what he's up to in the rest of Europe, his interference there and here, his relationship with his own oligarchs, the rise of authoritarianism, the way that Putin has kind of, reinvented himself as this avatar of sort of like white Christian nationalism, and that is his pitch to a lot of factions in the West. We don't agree with that vision. We want a much more pluralistic, inclusive, and democratic vision. And we should be very, very clear about that. So there are going to be areas where we have to push back in various ways, including with the use of targeted sanctions on individuals involved in these things. At the same time, it's imperative to find areas, because there certainly are areas where we need to cooperate, whether it's on non-proliferation, whether it's on climate change, or other issues like that. But I would say that the key thing, and this is where I think you see pretty strong consensus within the Democratic Party, is in, respecting, rebuilding our alliances. That our alliances, particularly the Transatlantic Alliance, is a core element of our own collective security. It's a core element of our kind of security concept for a very long time. And you referenced baby and bathwater, and I think that is one of the real challenges now, is saying, okay, listen, the so-called post World War II order, the liberal order, whatever one term one wants to use, there are ways in which that has worked. There are ways in which it's certainly not worked. And so let's find out what is baby and what is bathwater.
Yeah, picking up on that, I was going to ask you, how do you pursue engagement with someone like Putin without basically abandoning our frontline partners? I mean, you look at what's happening in Belarus right now, the Belarusian people who are showing in impressive ways that they want to change. We obviously have Ukraine, which is in an ongoing conflict with Russian forces that have invaded part of their country, have annexed Crimea. You have states like Georgia, who also have borne the brunt of Putin's aggression. Is there a way to have conversations with a Russian regime like the one that Putin leads without sending the message to those frontline partners that somehow we're abandoning their cause?
I mean, I think there is, and just for an example, as, someone who's focused a lot on the Middle East, here I would use kind of the parallel of Iran. Now, I don't want to equate the Iran challenge with the Russian challenge. I think they are different in some ways. They're similar in other ways. But I think, as a supporter of President Obama's nuclear agreement, I think that was a good example of, listen, we have this shared issue, shared concern with Iran's nuclear program. We're going to work with our allies. We're going to forge a multilateral consensus around how to deal with this problem. We're going to use economic pressure, to kind of, present Iran with some choices, and we'll come to an agreement that limits that program, that takes it off the table, even if only temporarily. But all non-proliferation agreements are temporary. But that doesn't mean that we then kind of pull back, or it shouldn't mean that we pull back and stop putting pressure on a whole range of other things that Iran is doing in the region. Now, I think one can say that we should have done this in closer consultation or paid closer attention to some of our partners in the region. I tend to think, I think there's some validity to that, but I also think some of those complaints tend to be overblown. But leaving that aside, I think the key here is to just be clear about what we are trying to do, so that both our allies and adversaries have a very clear understanding. Because right now, I think that's one of the things that we lack, is that allies and adversaries alike are not quite clear what the United States is actually trying to do. And I think that's potentially very dangerous.
I'm going to avoid the temptation to debate Iran policy, but moving, because it's a similar dynamic, I think, picking up where you left off with allies being uncertain about what our overall strategic direction is. I want to discuss the China challenge a little bit, because it's also very relevant for the digital challenges that we discussed at the top. Obviously, the Chinese, the US intelligence community has now said this publicly, the Chinese are also trying to interfere in American politics. They're doing it in different ways, I think, than the Russians. But one of the significant challenges, and I saw this when I was at RFERL as well, China is trying to control the infrastructure across which a lot of these digital communications are going to be happening in the years ahead. And the Trump administration has, after obviously a lot of back and forth about different approaches, has settled on a pretty tough approach of trying to push them out of certain technologies, certain spheres. The administration's either been trying to unilateralize those platforms, or to bring in partners, Europeans and Asian allies, to work on technical solutions. What's your take on that when it comes to the approach on TikTok, for instance, or Huawei and 5G? Do you think that there are any valid aspects of what the administration, the Trump administration, has been trying to do? Or is there any way that you would advocate doing it differently?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the concerns are very real. No one, I think, denies that. But I think this kind of like whipsawing back and forth, a sledgehammer one day and kind of friendly phone calls the next day, again, just goes to this confusion I was talking about earlier. So, I mean, I think the challenge that we deal with China is, a similar, obviously the relationship between these tech companies and the Chinese government is symbiotic. It's very, very close. There's very little division there. They're essentially part of the same conglomerate. But at the same time, I think we have some very real questions about, how our own corporations and tech companies use people's data. And again, not to promote an equivalence here, but I think we have, if we want to promote, rather than just attacking China or banning TikTok or banning whatever new, tech toy comes out next, let's come to some agreement, some shared principles about what information companies can harvest and hold on to and use as part of their model. And here again, this involves working with our allies, working through multilateral institutions, the UN and others, to create some kind of shared consensus about the use of this information in the first place.
Well, we actually just got a question related to that, which I think picks up on where you were headed, and asks about the prospects for transatlantic alignment on issues of tech regulation and privacy in the coming years. And it sounded to me like you were advocating for basically a multilateral approach to this. So the questioner is asking, do you see positions on each side as reconcilable, or are the US and Europe too far apart on these issues? So what's your response to that? My interpretation is you're saying that actually we need to work more with allies and partners and others in a multilateral framework, but Tell me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what I'm saying. So, I think, as the questioner is right, I think there are, there's some ways in which we're far apart, but I think once you have kind of a shared understanding of the challenge, of the threat, then you can start to find areas of common ground for regulation. So again, I don't mean to punt here by just saying it's complicated, but it is. But I think coming to a shared understanding of what the actual challenges are, and also being willing to deal with those issues via regulation, because that's a kind of a first principle on which there has always been some kind of difference between our European friends and here in the United States. We're much more anti-regulatory, but I think we need to, just bottom line, we need to get over that if we want to deal with this problem.
Did you find, is your sense, you're still working for Senator Sanders, but during the campaign, was this an issue that really excited Sanders supporters? Because my own experience has been that it's very difficult to convince many Americans of the importance of this issue. I think so many Americans are consumers of information online. I think only a small segment of people take the time to think through the consequences of their actions on social media and really understand what is going on beneath the surface. And so I'm just curious if you've had a different experience where you found that the people you engaged in, Sanders supporters, really embraced the need for additional government regulation and some sort of drastic action to rein in the tech companies.
I mean, my quick answer is yes, but it's also, I mean, if you see, one of the things that's shared amongst not just Sanders supporters, but the broader, I think, progressive left in the Democratic Party and beyond, is this understanding that power has accrued into fewer and fewer hands. And this has inequality of political and economic power has very, very real negative consequences for people's daily lives, but also for the future of democracy. And so I think that's how I contextualize that. It's true in the United States, and it's true more broadly in the world.
We've got a couple more questions that have come in. One relates to whether the U.S. Administration, I'm assuming it's implying a Biden administration here, because I don't think the Trump administration would pursue this approach, but the question is, could the administration adopt the EU GDPR as a basis for defining common standards for regulation of internet platforms or providers? Do you have any thoughts on, I don't know if you've looked at the GDPR approach in Europe and any thoughts about whether that could
I'll do a very un-Washington thing and say I haven't looked into that enough to offer a smart sounding answer, so I won't even try, but I'll just say quickly, I think, Americans tend to want to do things our own way. So yeah, we'll be happy to look at what others are doing. But I think that the key thing is breaking through this aversion to regulation. And I think we're reaching a point where we're going to be ready to do that.
On the flip side, another questioner asks, why is it, and I think this is directed for you, Matt, why is it that most dilemmas presented by progress are treated by liberals with either throwing money or regulating? And why disregard the virtues of innovation and competition, which I think raises an important point, especially given that we're so focused on the emerging competition with China. You can overregulate, you can make it difficult for innovation to occur. And obviously the US tech sector is a perfect example of the benefits of freedom in our society. Don't we run a risk of compromising all of that if you go too far with these efforts to break up the tech platforms?
No, I think you are. There is a danger, but I don't see any really plausible argument that what we suffer from is an overabundance of regulation. I think we saw, through the 80s and into the 90s, the Telecommunications Act, just, massive deregulation. And again, it's difficult just to say, well, we did this, then we did this, and then we did this, and then things got bad. Certainly there's a place for competition. There's a way, I think innovation, we want a system where innovation and creativity is rewarded. But at the same time, I think in any sector, you need to set some rules of the road. And when those rules appear, as I think they appear now, not to be sufficient or are completely outpaced by the evolution and growth of that technology. I think it's just part of responsible democratic governance to say, okay, we need to look at this again and maybe come up with some new rules, maybe to come up with different rules.
So it sounds like from our conversation, you believe that this is something, this sort of platform that has broad support on the left, that it's something that voters care about and will probably be engaging on in the new administration.
I would think that yes. I mean, you're going to still see a lot of pressure, I think, from the progressive left and perhaps beyond to address these issues. Now, obviously, we confront, the other side has a lot of resources and certainly an interest in less regulation. But yeah, no, I would say that this, and just in the context that I put it a few moments ago, as a part of addressing the massive disparity or the kind of concentration of business and political power in fewer and fewer hands, that's something that it's very, characterizes, I think, the new progressive left.
We've got about 10 minutes left in the conversation. I have a couple questions for Matt about where democratic foreign policy is likely headed, but if you have other issues that you want to raise, feel free to raise your hand or just submit them in the chat and I'll pose them to Matt. So I'm just curious about your general assessment about the general election campaign thus far and how it's going from your perspective, whether there have been any surprises, if this is the general election campaign that you expected. How would you rate how Biden is doing vis-a-vis Trump and the sort of campaign that both of them are running right now?
Well, I'm hesitant to rate them like that. I mean, certainly, I think it's no surprise that no one expected a campaign like this, to be carried out like this, as we are all doing on Zoom. And there's really nothing to compare it to. But, I think in terms of just speaking about foreign policy and the way that the foreign policy debate has shaped up on the Democratic side, I think there was, I give the Biden team a great deal of credit. I think they showed very early on, both publicly and privately, that they wanted to engage not only with Senator Sanders' team, with his supporters, but with the broader progressive left. And I think you've seen some evidence of that in some of the things that were, the commitments that were made as part of the Democratic platform, ending forever war, ending, rejecting regime change as a goal of foreign policy, a number of other things that I think progressives have been pushing for on foreign policy for a very long time. But I think there is, and I think my boss has been very clear about this from the very beginning. We all share a goal right now, which is to help Joe Biden win. But we do, we'll continue to have these debates in as constructive a way as possible, both before and during the new administration.
Do you think there's obviously one of the issues in 2016 facing Hillary Clinton was this lack of excitement on the left about her candidacy? Obviously, Trump as a candidate drew people to the polls. He, in many cases, it looks like, brought people into the political arena who had not participated, at least in the last several elections. Do you think that lack of excitement is a problem for the Democrats again this year? Or is Trump, the mere reaction to Trump, enough to get people out to vote and to get them politically engaged? I mean, how do you gauge the excitement levels about the Biden campaign at this point?
I mean, again, being here at home for most of the past months, as most of us has, still, I don't think there's a lack of excitement or a lack of engagement or motivation on the part of the Democrats, certainly having seen what's been going on for the past few years. I think the stakes are very, very clear in a way that they perhaps weren't in 2016 for a lot of folks. But I would also say, like, one of the things, and this is, it's just understanding, it's easy to over interpret some of these events, but I do think that one thing we have seen, and this goes to what I was saying about some of the concerns about the concentration of power and the growth of inequality and things like that, is, understanding the extent to which Trump himself is a product of the status quo. Certainly he's an accelerant, in my view, of a lot of some of these negative trends. which we can or cannot, or can or won't get into, depending. But I think understanding some of the trends that helped give rise to candidate and then President Trump, and understanding that some of these concerns come from a very real place of concern and distress. Some of them are driven by much more negative, things like racism, bigotry, and stuff like that. But I do think, we see not only in the United States, but around the world. I think if you look back to the end of 2019, you saw a whole set of demonstrations and uprisings in countries all around the world, whether it was Chile, Haiti, Argentina, Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, even Hong Kong, and more. Now, I think some of the details of these protest movements differ, but I think if you look at some of the commonalities, they are very striking, like an opposition to corruption, anger at kind of self-dealing elites, anger at political repression, the desire for economic opportunity. I think understanding this as a really important global trend, because those energies can be pointed in a positive direction, or they can be pointed in a much more negative and divisive and destructive direction. So I think it's really important for us to try and focus them on the former.
I understand the critique you're advancing about Trump. The interesting thing, though, is, and there have been a lot of studies. I don't know that anyone has proven this, but there's been a lot of suspicion that some of the types of voters that Senator Sanders appealed to, certainly in 2016, I don't know about the current demographic, actually overlap with Trump voters to a certain extent. I mean, people who maybe have been fed up with conventional American politics, have been frustrated with the elites in both parties. I mean, what's your take on that? Do you think that's an unfair argument to advance, that there is some overlap between Trump and Sanders supporters? Because obviously, if that's the case, then it gets a little dicey to start arguing that at least a large majority of Trump voters are driven by race and all these.
Well, no, I think it's not unfair. I think one can overstate that. I mean, I think it's clear. I mean, first of all, I'll state unequivocally that the vision that Senator Sanders is offering for an inclusive and pluralistic United States is very, very different from anything Donald Trump and his movement is offering. But I think that basic sense of a number of voters that this system is not working for me and my children and my family. I mean, that's not something we just saw in 2016. I mean, we saw this, the kind of, the so-called Obama to Trump voters. There were voters in 2008 who were like, I'm going to try the new guy because, this old system doesn't working. This guy is offering some new ideas and some new energy. I'm just going to try that. I mean, and this goes to what I was saying about these energies, and this kind of discontent can be focused in good ways or in bad. Let's talk about ways that we can focus it in good.
Yeah. We're running out of time. We got a few more minutes. I want to take a question that Maya Kandel sent in about what in your mind would be the most important input of the progressive left on a Democratic administration's foreign policy. Basically, is there a Biden vision in foreign policy? I was going to ask you a version of this. Basically, what are the one or two things that you'd like to see a Biden administration prioritize that you feel would validate a lot of the concerns of the progressive left?
Well, I think one of them is, and this is something he has already committed to, is rejoining the JCPOA. And again, not trying to bait you here. I know that you were a critic of it. But for me, I think the Iran nuclear agreement was, I think, a fulfillment of a promise and a commitment that Obama himself made very early on in when he was a candidate, where he said, I don't want to just end the Iraq war. I want to end the mindset that got us into the war in the first place. And, as I would describe that mindset, it's just an over-reliance on military force, kind of a kind of belief that our ability to create these kinds of outcomes through the correct application and the amount of force that we apply or economic pressure, and I think has proven fairly disastrous, well, not fairly, very disastrous in the wake of Iraq and beyond. But yet the Iran nuclear agreement was, listen, we can work diplomatically with allies, forge and marshal and mobilize a consensus around the problem, and come to an agreement that handles that problem. If not completely, it's not perfect, no agreement is perfect, but it deals with the problem as best we can do it. So, I mean, I think Biden's commitment to rejoin that deal, not surprisingly, because he and his team played a role in it during the Obama administration, but I also think the way they go about rejoining that deal will have a series of knock-on effects, not only in the region, but around the world. I think, you know, the Iran policy, Trump's Iran policy, I mean, if you just look over the past few days with this bizarre announcement that snapback is back, but I mean, snapback is not back at all. The UN, you know, unequivocally rejected the U.S. effort to impose snapback. So now the United States is just basically, you know, sanctioning a bunch of people who disagree with us. I mean, this has done a great deal to you know, it's created a lot of tension between the U.S. and our closest allies. So I think repairing that is hugely important. But again, the way to repair that, the way to really rebuild trust in American foreign policy is to rebuild a durable political consensus around what our foreign policy is. And I think that is a much bigger challenge, is to, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, we're running out of time, but just to end on this note, push back a little bit. I mean, number one, Trump, if Trump's reelected, he said that he'll get a new deal with the mullahs in, was it 30 days or 45 days? So he might even beat the Biden administration back into a nuclear deal. But aren't there aspects of the Trump policy that the progressive left should celebrate? I mean, you've talked about earlier ending the forever wars. I mean, that's a Trump campaign talking point at this point.
Well, it's a talking point, but that's all it is, right? He got more troops in the region than when he began. He says he's withdrawing troops. I mean, he'll do something completely, I think, counterproductive and dangerous, like just moving troops around Syria, selling out the Kurds. But in the end, he just shifts them around somewhere else in the country. I think what Trump's commitment to end the endless war tells us is that there's an enormous, you know, there's a lot of support among American voters for these ideas. And that's what that should tell us. I mean, I think he's doing that because perhaps he understands that, you know, his whole approach is based around, listen, we're getting ripped off, we're spending money, we're not getting anything. So I understand the point you're making, but again, looking at what the actual policy and looking for actual evidence that he's committing to ending the forever war, I don't see very much.
So one final question, beyond getting back into the JCPOA, other things you're looking for from a Biden administration, and I'll throw in on personnel. How concerned are you that, how would you and Senator Sanders respond to a Secretary of State, Romney, for instance?
You know, I mean, I'm not going to jump at that. I think I'll just say this. I think, listen, we've had a good, you know, ongoing conversation with them on foreign policy on a range of other issues. We understand there are some differences, you know, between Vice President Biden and some others in the party, and you know, that's a valid debate that we'll continue to have. So I think ultimately we're just going to continue to stay engaged as constructively as we can. Great. Well, we're a little bit over time. Thanks to everyone for joining. Thanks for the questions that you submitted. And thanks, Matt, for taking the time. I know you're busy to have this conversation, and follow GMF for information about the next Transatlantic Tuesdays in several weeks. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.